Good evening and welcome. We'll get started very soon. Thank you all for being here tonight. As we get started, we wanted to let you know that we are recording this. We are very excited for our presentation tonight. IDA Georgia is here to serve families, educators, and professionals concerned with struggling readers and dyslexia. And we hold outreach events like this to help people connect with professionals on a wide variety of topics. Tonight, we are really excited to talk about private versus school evaluations. And we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Brandy Tanner to join us tonight. Dr. Tanner has over 15 years of experience working with children and adolescents with learning and behavioral problems. She's both a licensed psychologist and a certified school psychologist. Dr. Tanner earned her bachelor's degree in elementary education and master's degree in special education from West Virginia University. She entered her working career as a special education teacher and later returned to school and earned her doctoral degree in school psychology from the University of South Florida. Dr. Tanner's doctoral level education training includes experiences in assessment and treatment of learning and behavioral problems for children and adolescents, systems level consultation in response to intervention, RTI, and treatment integrity in school interventions. Upon completion of her PhD, Dr. Tanner worked as a school psychologist in Metro Atlanta school districts for years. Currently, she provides comprehensive psychological and psychoeducational evaluations in her private practice, Lightway Psychological Services. She provides special education advocacy services through Your IEP Source. Dr. Tanner, we are thrilled to have you here with us tonight, and the show is yours.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction. And also thank you very much for the opportunity and the forum that you're providing to share this information with parents. As you mentioned in my introduction, I'm in the unique position of having been a school psychologist and also being a psychologist in private practice. So even though those positions require administering a lot of the same tests, the procedures and circumstances around those different types of evaluations are somewhat different. So I wanted to share some information with families to help them understand kind of what some of the similarities are and what the differences are. So I hope everyone that has joined us this evening finds the information helpful. As a disclaimer, before we jump into the actual information that we're going to be discussing tonight, what we're going to be discussing is for general and educational purposes only. It's not meant to be any kind of clinical, legal, psychological types of services or advice. Everybody's situation is unique and specific. So I would always suggest you consult with your own providers and get information about your specific information. And also, we can't guarantee any specific outcomes for you by using the information that we're discussing this evening. So that being said, as an overview, there are a lot of tangents that we could potentially go off onto from the things that we're going to be discussing this evening, but I want to try to keep the discussion contained to the similarities and differences between school psychological evaluations and private evaluations, what those similarities and differences are, and what families need to know in order to make the decision about which type of evaluation might be best for your circumstances, and also how to use that information if you would like to try to pursue school services in a public school system for your child. So with that being said, the things that we're going to discuss are potential outcomes of an evaluation. We're going to discuss the different training and qualifications of the evaluators. We'll discuss considerations regarding privacy and confidentiality, timelines and fees, We'll also talk about the use of private evaluations in school decision-making, and we'll also talk a little bit about the school special education eligibility process in case that's where you're wanting to use your evaluation results. So we're going to be doing some switching back and forth between school definitions and terminology and medical definitions and terminology. So I wanted to put some of those out there just so that we can have a framework to work off of. The International Dyslexia Association definition of dyslexia is here on the screen for you. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurobiological in origin. It's characterized by difficulties with accurate or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. These difficulties result from a deficit in phonological component of language that's often unexpected in relation to the cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension, reduced reading experience that can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. So that's our IDA definition of dyslexia. On the school side of things, IDEA stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that's our federal law that governs special education. So on that side, their definition of a specific learning disability is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations, including conditions such as perceptual disabilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. So looking at those two definitions together, even though the wording is different, we're basically talking about the same type of person. And that's a person that has difficulty with reading, decoding, and also with reading fluency. So those are the terminologies that are used across the board and in the different settings. But generally speaking, we're talking about the same type of processes, even though the wording and the terminology that is used on both sides might be slightly different. So when we're talking about an evaluation that is going to assess those areas and assess those difficulties that could potentially be associated with dyslexia, we're going to be doing that through a psychoeducational evaluation. So, major components of a psychoeducational evaluation include an assessment of the individual's overall intellectual ability or IQ, an assessment of different cognitive or psychological processing areas, their academic skills, oral language, reading, writing, and math skills. We also may need to look at attention and executive functioning. We may need to do some assessment of social, emotional, and behavioral functioning, and potentially some assessment of adaptive functioning. Specifically, when we're looking at a potential dyslexia diagnosis, there are some certain processing areas that we want to make sure that we're including in the evaluation. And there are also some specific academic areas that we want to make sure that we're including in that evaluation. So starting from the top of that list, phonological awareness refers to an individual's ability to be able to manipulate the sounds that are in words. Can you generate rhyming words? Can you break words down into their segments? Can you substitute sounds in words? For example, can you substitute the first letter of fan and can so that you can switch words, switch sounds and put together new words when you're reading? Phonological memory refers to your ability to be able to recall sounds, syllables, and words. Rapid automatic naming refers to your ability to quickly pull information out of your memory. Can you quickly name letters, numbers, colors, objects? Vocabulary obviously is, do you understand the words that are being spoken to you and you're able to comprehend and use that language? Phonics skills refers to your ability to have sound and symbol correspondence. Are you able to match the letter sounds with the written letters in order to be able to decode? Getting more into the academic skills that we're looking at specifically with a dyslexia evaluation, we really want to get a good read on what the individual's decoding skills are like. So that's going to be their ability to decode both real words and also nonsense words so that we can check to see, even if they haven't memorized what that word looks like, are they able to put the sounds together to make the word? Oral reading fluency, are they able to quickly and accurately read text and also read in a way that they are understanding the phrasing that goes along with that, with the passage that they're reading? We also want to check out the individual's spelling at the individual word level. And we also want to check out their writing ability, both at the sentence and paragraph level. So there are multiple different assessments that can be used to test all of these different areas. But generally speaking, these are the areas that we want to look at and that we're primarily concerned with when we're trying to determine if a person could potentially have dyslexia. So with this presentation, I'm sure that many of you are wondering right up front, which one is best? Is a school evaluation best, or is a private evaluation best? And I'm here to tell you that it depends. In some situations and for some families, a school evaluation is going to get us to where we want to go. In some situations, we might want to look at a private evaluation for different reasons. So we're going to be going through several different areas so that we can figure out what's going to be right for your child and what's going to be right for your family. So one of the first things that we want to consider, we want to start out by thinking about what we want to happen as a result of the evaluation. So we want to start out with the end in mind and consider the potential outcomes of the evaluation. So the main differences with this would be, are we concerned about school eligibility or a medical diagnosis? So when you're thinking about this, some of the overarching questions you want to ask yourself are, what would you like to gain from the evaluation? Is it a situation where your main primary concern is that you're looking for special education services for your child at school? You think that your child needs an IEP in a public school system, and that is the main thing that you're looking for. That's one potential thing that could be a concern. It might be a situation where you are looking for information that is going to support admission to a particular school or program that you feel like might help your child. It might be a situation where you're trying to determine if your child meets criteria for a specific diagnosis. We'll talk a little bit more about dyslexia and sometimes associated different types of conditions that sometimes come along with it. It might be a situation where you want to have information in order to make a good comprehensive treatment plan that's going to assess all areas that your child needs help with. So in addition to academic skills, do you have other concerns about how your child's doing that we want to make sure that we're covering in this assessment? And sometimes, particularly in the case of reevaluations where somebody has already been tested and diagnosed, sometimes the evaluation, a major driver is we need documentation for continued accommodations. So for example, our high school students might need updated testing so that they can qualify for accommodations on SAT or ACT, or also students that are transitioning from high school into a college setting might need an updated evaluation to confirm their diagnosis and the need for accommodations. So getting into a little bit of the differences between the evaluations with regard to those questions. The primary purpose of a school evaluation is to determine if the student meets criteria for special education services. The IDEA, the federal law that I discussed a few minutes ago that governs special education, has 13 13 different categories of special education services that we could consider a child to be eligible for services under. So the one that is most closely linked to dyslexia out of those 13 categories would be specific learning disability. School psychoeducational evaluations don't result in diagnoses. With a school evaluation, they are trying to determine if the student meets criteria for special education services. So it's not a diagnosis. On the private evaluation side of things, the primary purpose is to determine if that student meets criteria for a diagnosis that's listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition. So that's the DSM, that's the book that private psychologists use in order to review the diagnostic criteria and see if an individual meets criteria for a diagnosis. So this is more in line with the medical model. We're not restricted to 13 categories like they are on the school side of things. There's actually 157 diagnoses that are in the most current edition. And with the private psychoeducational evaluation, we could potentially find out, does that student meet diagnostic criteria for dyslexia or any other conditions that could potentially come along with it or that it might mimic. But also a thing that we want to keep in mind is that diagnosis does not guarantee eligibility for school services. So those are the primary similarities and differences between those two. So just to kind of talk about that comparison a little bit more. The school eligibility, once we have the results of the psychoeducational evaluation, the committee will meet and review the information and see, does that student meet one of the criteria for one of those 13 categories? Again, it's not going to be a medical diagnosis. With a private evaluation, that evaluator is going to review multiple sources of data, determine if the child meets criteria for a diagnosis, and you could potentially submit that to be considered for eligibility on the school side. Private evaluations are a medical diagnosis, and if we find out that there's any kind of medication, treatment, anything like that that can be needed, that would be considered as acceptable for those types of circumstances. So with this, we just want to keep in mind that one of the primary differences between these two types of evaluations is a school can't diagnose a student. They can determine if that student is eligible for special education services. On a private evaluation, a doctor or psychologist can give a diagnosis, but they can't determine unilaterally by themselves if a child is eligible for special education services. So keeping that in mind, there are some conditions that sometimes come along with dyslexia that we also want to be considering if that could be something that's going on with that particular child. So with a school evaluation, we're going to get some categories. These are the categories that a student can be determined to be eligible to receive special education services under. I place the arrow beside specific learning disability because that's the one that we're most likely going to be concerned with if we suspect that somebody may have dyslexia. A lot of times we can potentially have comorbid ADHD, and that would be classified under the category other health impairment, which is down on the lower left side of this slide. Also, sometimes anxiety and depression sometimes come along with dyslexia or can develop over time. So taking a look at the school eligibilities, we've got some big categories here, but it's not specifically going to say, does this student have ADHD? That would be classified under that other health impairment category. It's not going to specifically say, does that student have anxiety? That would be more classified under the emotional disturbance. And again, like I mentioned before, and we'll talk about going forward in the presentation, the category that's most closely aligned with dyslexia for the school categories is specific learning disability. I just want to make a point here at this point in the presentation that, if we suspect that any of those other things could potentially be going on, we want to make sure that we're including assessment of those areas, attention, executive functioning, potential emotional problems as a part of the assessment, because that's going to make us have the best kind of treatment plan that we possibly could. I recently tested a nice young lady that, in addition to the academic difficulties that she was having, she had some pretty serious anxiety that needed to be addressed, like to the point that she was having physical panic attacks. So if we had went in there and only looked at academics, we could have potentially missed that. And that's going to be a really major part of her treatment plan. Also, sometimes there's a high comorbidity rate of ADHD with dyslexia. So if it's a situation where inattention or hyperactivity is coming into play, and we need to take that into account in the overall plan that we're making to work with that student, we want to make sure that we get that assessed and documented properly as well. So as I alluded to just a few minutes ago, we've got just a few of the conditions that are likely to come along with dyslexia. Out of those with dyslexia, approximately 12 to 25% also have ADHD. Many people with dyslexia potentially have developmental coordination disorder. That would be difficulty with your motor skills. Oppositional defiant disorder estimated at 17%. Anxiety up to 29%. And there's also 2 to 5% of children who, in addition to having a dyslexia diagnosis, are also gifted. So there are lots of different things that we want to be keeping in mind. While dyslexia may be a major player that's going on with an individual, we want to make sure that we're doing a nice, thorough assessment that gets a good, clear picture of what's going on with them overall, so that we can make a really good treatment plan for them. So the next pieces of information that we're going to discuss have to do with the training and qualifications that are required of the evaluators. So pretty much the differences between what it takes to be a school psychologist and what it takes to be a licensed psychologist in private practice. The main professional organization for school psychologists is NASP. That stands for the National Association of School Psychologists. Their definition of a school psychologist are individuals who are uniquely qualified members of the school team that support the student's ability to learn and the teacher's ability to teach. They apply expertise in mental health, learning, and behavior to help children and youth succeed academically, socially, behaviorally, and emotionally. So you can see this is a really well-rounded picture that's taken into account both the mental health side of things, the academic side of things. So school psychologists have expertise in all of those things that they can potentially be using to work with students. As far as the training that a school psychologist has, a school psychologist typically is required to have a specialist degree, which that basically means a master's degree plus 30 hours of additional instruction, including an internship. In Georgia, that's actually the highest level of training that's required for any entry-level position in the school system. So potentially the school psychologist is going to be one of the most highly trained people that is a part of your school team or a part of your committee. School psychologists are certified by the state organization that certifies teachers. So for us here in Georgia, that would be the Professional Standards Commissions. So the organization that gives teacher certificates, school psychologists are also certified under that same organization. School psychologists work primarily with the eligibility criteria, those 13 categories that we discussed, as their framework for determining what is going on with the student and how they're going to work with them on the school side of things. There are some school psychologists that have a doctoral degree. As you can see, it's not required to be a school psychologist. And also, because a school psychologist has a doctoral degree doesn't mean necessarily that they're licensed. So myself, I started out as a school psychologist. I did earn my doctoral degree before I worked in the school setting. And when I made the decision that I wanted to switch from a school setting only, which Having that certificate from the Professional Standards Commission limits your practice to only in a school setting. When I made the decision that I wanted to work with families in a more broad range and work in a private practice setting, there were several additional things that I had to do in order to become a licensed psychologist. So as I previously mentioned, to be a licensed psychologist, that means you're eligible to do private practice and work outside of a school setting. It does require a doctoral degree. The specialist level internship required 1,500 hours. The doctoral level required 2,000 hours. It did require taking a national examination. Psychologists refer to this test as the EPPP. I basically spent a whole summer vacation from my work when I would usually have a summer off as a school psychologist to spend 3 months preparing for this evaluation in order to be able to pass it. Most states do require postdoctoral training. So after I had a doctoral degree, I'm studying for this evaluation, the national exam. I also had to work under a psychologist that is already licensed and receive supervision for them for an additional year. So as you can see, there's a lot more additional things that you need to go through in order to become licensed for private practice. Another distinction between school psychologists and licensed psychologists is instead of using those 13 categories that the school uses, we're using the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, as the framework for doing diagnosis. So on the school side of things, there are a lot of things that school psychologists are really good at. School psychologists are usually very good assessors because it's almost always a very major component of your job is to do testing and evaluations. So school psychologists are almost always very good assessors. There are some things, unfortunately, that are kind of out of the hands of school psychologists that might make things a little bit difficult for them, even though they usually do have good assessment skills. Some of those things would be the size of the caseload. How many students is your district expecting you to be able to test, write reports for, and provide any type of therapy and consultation services for? Another thing might be, what kind of access do you have to the assessment materials that you need in order to be able to do your job? Do you have all the tests that you need? Do you have access to them on a daily basis? Do you have to share them? Do you have to go somewhere else to pick them up and borrow them on an as-needed basis? That can potentially be something that can make it a little bit harder to work as a school psychologist. Could potentially be administrative influence. You know, the district said, I have to do it like this. Our school policy is to do it in this way. And then another factor might be the input and cooperation from the rest of the eligibility committee. As we go forward, we'll be talking more about how school eligibility works. And it's not just up to the school psychologists by themselves. The committee is going to have to work together. So we need those other people working together in tandem with us. And sometimes that can be difficult. Going back to that caseload issue that I discussed a few minutes ago, the recommended ratio of school psychologists to students, as recommended by NASP, the National Association of School Psychologists, is 1 school psychologist for every 500 students. So that is the recommended level. Currently, the national ratio is estimated to be at 1 school psychologist for every 1,211 students. So, you know, like we're over double the number of students that we should have at a national level. For those of us here in Georgia, the funding ratio for school psychologists is currently set at 1 school psychologist for every 2,475 students. So that means we're nearly 5 times the ratio that is recommended by our national professional organization. Another thing to note is that according to our state association, that funding has remained the same for at least 25 years. So, whenever School Psychology Awareness Week comes around, like it did just a few weeks ago, we want to try to raise awareness and kind of drive home the need for school psychologists so that they're able to provide the level of services that is going to help as many students as they can possibly be helping. Another thing, that is going on currently that we can't really turn a blind eye to because it just seems to not keep going away is, the number of evaluations that was going to be there. In a lot of cases, it was going to be tight. There were a lot of students to test. And then when COVID happened, that made a backlog of students that need to be tested. So, that has also made this situation really ugly. On the considerations for private psychologists, there are a lot of psychologists out there that are great assessors in the private side of things. That's their specialty area. They do testing and they test kids all day, every day. That's their particular area of specialization. If you are looking for a private psychologist to do an evaluation, I think it's a good idea for you to consider, is this particular psychologist area of specialization? Do they do testing and they do testing with kids? Is that a major part of their practice? Or is it, like sometimes I'm doing therapy with adults and I'm sometimes doing testing with kids. You want to try to get an idea of what is that person's level of specialization is, and is this something that they do all the time and that they're very familiar with? Also, we want to take into consideration what is the age level of the clients that this particular psychologist serves. I recently did a consultation with a fellow psychologist who reached out to me because they had some questions about their own child. And this person was like, well, I am a psychologist, but I specialize in working with the geriatric population. So even though that person, does evaluations and testing all the time, they wouldn't be an appropriate person to do an assessment for a child. Another thing that I want for people to think about when you're considering, what private psychologist might I want to do an assessment for my child is, I feel like there's a lot of times an emphasis on the length of the evaluation report. And I really like when people focus on the quality of the report. Sometimes it's like, wow, we have a 30-page report. That's really great. But at the end of the day, I really like to drill down into not how many pages long was the report, but what did you learn about this child, their learning, their processing, their strengths, their weaknesses, and how to support them better that you didn't already know before. Sometimes, even though a report is lengthy, it could just be a lot of fluff in there. It could just be a lot of computer-generated tables. It could just be computer-generated report. I really like for us to think about the quality of the evaluation in terms of what we learned and how much information we got in order to support the student. My personal bias in choosing a private evaluator is to select a person who is both dually licensed and credentialed. So as we mentioned a few minutes ago, somebody that works as a school psychologist is very familiar with those school eligibility criteria, and somebody that is a licensed psychologist that's familiar with the DSM framework, they're able to give a diagnosis. I sometimes in my private practice find myself jumping back and forth over that fence. The DSM criteria are not exactly the same as the school criteria, but it's a situation where I know that that student is going to be going back to their school team and potentially trying to seek services. I try to make sure that in my evaluation, I've included all the pieces of information the school team is going to need to make that determination, and any type of information that they might need that is going to support intervention for that student on the school side of things. So next category of things that we want to talk about when we're making a decision about a school evaluation versus a private evaluation is what level of privacy and confidentiality are you seeking through the process? So you might decide that you want to have a private evaluation so that you can increase the level of privacy of your information. If you have a school evaluation, that is going to become a part of your child's school record. It's not like, you can have it stricken or excluded or anything like that. With a private evaluation, you have the option once you have those results and you have that evaluation report, you can decide whether or not you want to share those results with the school or not. Every now and then I have a family that, wants to say like, I don't want the school to know about this at all. As an evaluator, there are times when I really do need information from the school. I need that child's teacher to provide some input, complete a rating scale, so that we can get information about the school side, because we need to know how they're performing in multiple settings. For some diagnoses, for example, if we think someone may have ADHD, we need to confirm that they have symptoms that are present in multiple different settings. So we do need that information. However, at the end of the evaluation, you have your report, you can decide whether or not you want to share those results or not. Just a side note about privacy with school records. Whenever people ask me to fax reports to schools, I just won't do it. After working in schools for several years, I'd see, like the fax machine that's in a common area where people are walking around with a psych report just getting spit out of it and nobody's standing there to collect it and keep it private. So just keep in mind, like whenever you're sharing information, who's going to have access to it. And it's my preference to try to keep your information only into the hands of those that need it. Other things that you're going to need to consider between a school psych and a private psych are how fast can you get the evaluation done and how much will it cost. So we're going to be talking about timelines and for school evaluations, the rules are different between an initial evaluation and a re-evaluation. So with an initial evaluation, that's for a child that does not have any IEP. They don't have speech, they didn't have preschool services. This is an evaluation for somebody that could potentially be brand new to special education. In situations, that evaluation is going to be on a 60-day timeline that begins when your consent for evaluation is signed. We're going to be talking more about that 60-day timeline when we get specifically into the school side of things, but that 60-day timeline is for initial school evaluation. For school re-evaluations, the rules are slightly different. On the school side of things, re-evaluations are due every 3 years. So what typically happens is at year 2, the team will have a discussion about the reevaluation that is due in year 3. So it might be that discussion by the team goes something like, well, we have report card data, we have progress monitoring data, we know that this student is still working towards the goals and objectives and they still continue to need special education support. We don't think that this child needs to have a full comprehensive psychological evaluation right now. We are confident that they continue to meet the criteria for special education and testing is not recommended. If you have a student that is already receiving services, I just want to point this out to you because a lot of families that come to me are kind of shocked and surprised because this got kind of, like just slid through in the conversation and parents didn't really understand that discussion meant that they were not going to test their child at that 3-year mark. So if you have a student that's already receiving services and you want them to be retested, please pay particular attention to that discussion because they don't have to be retested, but it has to be redetermined if they're still eligible for services. Also with a reevaluation, that 60-day rule doesn't apply. If you're at the beginning of year 2 and their triennial evaluation date isn't until year 3, technically speaking, when they're lining up their due dates, they're going to say that the due date for that evaluation is going to be when that 3-year evaluation is due. So that 60-day rule isn't necessarily going to apply. As far as timelines for private evaluations, that can vary because each provider, their office, agency, wherever they're practicing, has their own policies and procedures. So if you are seeking a private evaluation, there are a couple of places where some providers sometimes have a longer gap between the dates than what other people do. So if you're particularly concerned about how quickly the evaluation is going to take place, in addition to just wondering how quickly can you get an in, you also want to ask them, okay, once I have this intake, can you estimate how long it's going to be until we have our actual testing appointment? You know, I've seen some situations where people have an intake, but then their testing is not scheduled for a couple of months. Also, once you have your you typically have a feedback appointment to discuss the results with the psychologist. You want to see if you're going to be receiving your written evaluation report at that same time or when it is you should expect to receive your written evaluation report. Because whatever services that you're going to be seeking, they're going to want to have the documentation of your results. So all 3 points along the way, if you're seeking a private evaluation, you're concerned about the timeline, I would ask about all of those things so that it's really clear up front how long it's going to take and you're not surprised on the end about waiting for testing or waiting for an evaluation result. Also, if you are seeking a private evaluation, I know that a lot of providers have been very booked up recently. So if it's on your mind and you're thinking about it, there's a high likelihood that you may be on a wait list or it may take a while for you to get an appointment. So I would encourage you to go ahead and call, set up that appointment, get on that wait list right away if you are seeking a private evaluation from somebody. A lot of families have come in concerned about how their child is doing after returning to school, after remote learning. So there have been a lot of people coming in for testing. So if you are seeking an evaluation, go ahead and get your appointment set up. Evaluation fees. Private psychoeducational evaluations can be very expensive. You know, if you're paying for a private psychoeducational evaluation, you should be prepared to pay a few $1,000s based on where you live. You know, like sometimes, you know, several $1,000s. Evaluations could potentially be available at a lower cost through a university clinic or a training center. In places like that, they're going to have their students who are supervised by the professors that are there administering the testing and working through those cases with them on a step-by-step basis. So, you know, they're completely supervised through the whole process. So that's how they're able to do it at a lower cost to you. But that's a potential consideration if you're looking for a lower cost evaluation. However, like I mentioned before about those wait lists, it could take you a while to get into one of those. So if you're thinking about going that route, go ahead and call and get your appointment set up. A lot of people ask about is psychoeducational evaluations can be covered by medical insurance, and this can potentially get a little bit tricky. So insurance companies will cover services that they consider to be medically necessary. Psychoeducational evaluations are excluded from many plans because they're not considered to be medically necessary. They're considered to be a school issue and not a medical issue. There are some cases where an evaluation might be partially covered by insurance. Perhaps we need to do a diagnostic evaluation to determine if somebody has ADHD or anxiety or both. A medical insurance company could potentially say, you know, like, yeah, you can do an evaluation to rule out those two medical conditions, anxiety and ADHD. However, if you want to test the academic skills, that's not anything medical. We're not going to cover that part. So sometimes, like I said, they can potentially be partially covered. If the provider that you're using is in network with your insurance, then they can submit claims for you on your behalf. If your plan has a copay, you would pay that. If you're working towards a deductible, you would pay that amount. If the provider that you're working with is out of network, they can provide you with a document that's called a super bill. And that is basically like a receipt for medical services you can send into your insurance. And if you have out of network benefits, they can potentially provide you with some reimbursement for that service. I don't have it on the slide, but another thing that people sometimes use for payment for the evaluations is a health savings account or an HSA. Regarding this insurance issue, a lot of times I will see families, when I used to work on the school side of things, where a family would come in and they would have a private evaluation, but it would not have academics in there with it. So we might be able to use part of that evaluation to determine eligibility, but we might have to do some supplemental testing. So if you're going to a private provider, you're using your insurance, make sure that you talk to them about, is that evaluation going to include everything you need for school eligibility? Particularly, is it going to include academics? And also keep in mind that insurance companies may only pay for a certain number of hours or units of testing, which also may limit the amount of assessment that the private provider is able to do if you're using your insurance benefits. That being said, we're going to transition into the next part of the discussion, which would be, can you use your private evaluation for requesting school services or accommodations? On the school side of things, they may accept your private psychological evaluation for use in determining eligibility for special education services. In order for them to accept it, your private evaluation is going to have to contain all the information that they need in order to make that eligibility determination. They're going to have to have tested all of the areas that are required and have scores in all of those areas so that the school can make their determination. There are some districts that even if you come in with a comprehensive private psychological evaluation that covers all the areas, there are some districts that it's just their policy that they require their own psychologist to still complete an evaluation. So that happens from time to time. Some districts have that policy and some don't. You could ask about it ahead of time if that's something that you're particularly concerned about. A district has to consider all the sources of information, which includes your private psychological evaluation, but they're not required to implement all of the recommendations, and they're not required to accept all the diagnoses that are listed in an evaluation. So, generally speaking, a lot of times we can use private psych information. They don't have to accept all of it. They do have to consider it. So next, we're going to be moving more into special education eligibility process and how that works, because a psychoeducational evaluation is just a part of the process. And there are a lot of other things that go into it in addition to that testing. I've got a full description of how special education eligibility process works, and a guide that I have on my website. It's got an infographic, a guide, a description of everything, of these phases that we're about to discuss. It's on my website at learn.youriepsource.com/eligibility. And basically, it's going to talk to you about the different phases of this eligibility process. First, we're going to talk about pre-referral activities. That's everything until we sign consent for the evaluation. Phase 2 would be the evaluation process, which is that 60-day timeline I had discussed before. And phase 3 is the eligibility determination, which means they're going to hold an eligibility meeting. So here's the infographic that I mentioned a few minutes ago. At the beginning with pre-referral activities, there's no timeline there. In the middle with the actual evaluation process, that's where our 60-day timeline is. And at the end, that's where we're meeting with the team and determining, is that student eligible for special services or not? And again, this is a part of the guide that's on my website. So in phase 1, this is, Generally speaking, pre-referral, that student's not officially been recommended for evaluation. They might be identified as having concerns through a screening. They might be identified by the parent, the teacher, or some other school staff as being at risk. And during that phase, they're going to implement some interventions and do some data collection. If that student is not making meaningful progress with that intervention, then they could be referred for a more comprehensive evaluation, that psychoeducational evaluation that we've been discussing. There's no timeline in this phase. So I have a lot of families come to me and say, we've been asking for testing. We want the school to give some services to our child. And basically they're caught up in this loop that has no time frame to it. So sometimes it's referred to, in the past couple of years, it had been referred to as response to intervention, RTI. A more broad term that's now being used, MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. Basically speaking, they're trying to see, can that student make sufficient progress with just what they can do in general ed before they make a special ed referral. In phase 2, that's when we're getting into the actual special education evaluation. It's going to be formal testing, continuing to implement those interventions and monitor the data, and also compiling some other data. In the formal evaluation, that's going to be the psychological evaluation. It could be the school psychologist doing that testing. It could be your private psychological evaluation, or it could be a combination of school and private evaluation. Like I mentioned before, if you're a private provider, just did diagnostic testing only, and the school needs to supplement with academic testing, it could be like that. There could potentially also be other formal testing, maybe a speech and language evaluation is needed, occupational therapy, if there's behavioral concerns, a functional behavioral assessment. So all of your formal evaluations should be taking place during the phase 2, the 60-day timeline part of this. After they have all the information from the formal evaluations, they have the data about how the student did with the interventions, they'll be holding an eligibility meeting, reviewing that data, and then the committee will make that determination about if that student is eligible for services. So again, these are the categories that we could potentially consider eligibility under. The one that we're most often looking at for dyslexia is learning disability, but we could potentially be looking at one of the other categories as well. If there are other issues or concerns, particularly other health impairment for ADHD, that's the most common one, or also speech language impairment. Information that's considered in eligibility, the formal evaluation results, so that would be your psychoeducational evaluation. If there was speech testing that was completed, those are your formal evaluations. They're also going to consider grades and classroom performance, standardized test scores, how is that student done on the milestones test or other standardized measures that are administered to all students. They're going to consider progress monitoring data, how much progress has that student made with the interventions that were put in place. They're also going to discuss exclusionary factors. There are some reasons why we would not find a student eligible for special education services. For example, if the main reason that that student was having academic difficulty was because English is not their first language and they don't speak English, and that's the primary reason for not making sufficient academic progress, we're not going to consider that as a student with a disability. We're going to try to rule out that language factor first. It also might be an attendance issue. If the student has missed serious amounts of school, we would want to consider, like, is the reason that they're not learning and progressing a lack of attendance and a lack of instruction. So those are examples of some of the exclusionary factors that might prevent us from finding a student eligible for special education services. And the other thing they're going to consider is the state rules and regulations for how they determine if the student is eligible. So the DSM criteria that private psychologists use is different than the eligibility criteria. And then when we break it down even more, we've got to look at how did that team interpret the data. So the DSM criteria is not the same as school. The federal government puts out a general definition for what each category is, but each state And in some states, each district makes its own eligibility criteria for how they determine if somebody qualifies for services. The team that is looking at that eligibility criteria then interprets the data that they have and makes the decision. So you can see there are lots of layers to this process and decision making. Even within the professional world, there has been debate about what a learning disability should be defined by. In the past, one of the main hallmarks of a dyslexia or learning disability diagnosis was a significant discrepancy between your IQ and achievement. So for example, if you had an IQ of 115, but your reading was down at 90, which is still in the average range, that was one of the major determinants. Now we're looking more at, like, does this student have skills that are significantly below average? But we don't really have a specific threshold that is a number that we're looking at as far as the scores. The actual Georgia special education eligibility criteria for specific learning disability is actually a 5-page document. But here is the main crux of the major pieces that's lifted straight out of that 5-page document that they're looking at when they make a eligibility determination. So a child who's eligible for services under specific learning disability must exhibit number 1, a deficit in basic phonological processing, 2, secondary underachievement, and then continuing on, they have to show a lack of response to intervention when they're getting that intervention and we're monitoring their progress. So interpreting the data is where these things get a little bit fishy and a little bit tricky. What is the threshold that determines underachievement? The criteria do not put out a score. They don't say it's the bottom 5%, which would be a score of 75. They don't say it's 1.5 standard deviations below the mean, which would be 78 or below. They leave that up to the committee in order to make that decision. Also, there are questions that the eligibility committee will have to answer about how's the lack of response to intervention being determined. Like, I unfortunately have been a part of school meetings where they're like, like, this child learned 3 letters, and I'm like, but they're in 3rd grade and they should be reading whole stories. That's not sufficient progress. The team has to determine, are they making progress at a rate that they're going to close that achievement gap? And then also we've got to consider what role do grades, standardized test scores, other sources of information play in the decision making. When we get to this point, my own personal opinion about this is, if this student has had a full comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation where they worked one-on-one with a professional in order to gather that assessment data, that needs to be one of the number 1 pieces of information that we're looking at and analyzing. With classroom grades, all of that is very subjective. I actually worked with a family before that the teacher went on maternity leave and everybody's grades tanked while she was on leave, and then she just gave everybody crossword puzzles to get their grades back up whenever she came back. So what do those grades really mean? In the days of COVID, when everybody was doing remote learning and you basically just got credit for showing up and trying, what do those grades really mean? I really like to place a lot of emphasis on data that we have from the psychoeducational evaluation, but all of these things are a part of the criteria that the team is going to be using in order to make that decision. So there are a lot of families that are seeking, where should I, like, place this blame if their child is not eligible. And sometimes it's not about the scores on the test. Sometimes it's about how the team interpreted those scores. So at the end of this, what are the possible outcomes of that eligibility determination? There are 3 different things that could possibly happen. First, we could find that student eligible for special education services and an IEP is developed. They start getting specialized instruction and we're monitoring how they're doing on their goals and objectives. And hopefully they start to make a lot of progress if we up the level of intervention that they're getting. Another possibility is if they're found ineligible for special education services, they might qualify for a 504 accommodation plan, which we'll talk about that more on the next couple of slides. Another option is you could potentially ask for an independent evaluation. So we'll also talk about that more in just a second. So some of the differences between a 504 plan and an IEP, I also have a guide for this on my website. It's learn.youriepsource.com/504. A 504 plan is not based on the special education law. It's based on the civil rights law that says we have to make accommodations for individuals that have some sort of a disability. So it's about access to instruction and not about the programming and educational side of things. The criteria to get a 504 plan is lower, and so it's a little bit easier to get it. They can at least get access to accommodations. However, on the programming side of things, it's not going to give any kind of specialized instruction. So again, this is kind of getting outside of the lanes of this presentation, but I did just want to bring it up that a 504 plan could be a potential outcome instead of an IEP. Another thing that can happen is if you really disagree with the results of the school evaluation, you could request what's called an IEE, that stands for Independent Educational Evaluation. This is a private evaluation that's at the school's expense. If you do decide to take this route, I would suggest that you make your formal request to the school and get it approved to make sure that they're going to pay for it rather than paying for it and hoping that they reimburse you on the end. But that is another avenue that you can take. Just remember that at the end of that IEE, you're going to come back to the same eligibility committee table, and that interpretation issue of how that team interprets the scores is going to come back into play. So is there a way that you can speed up this school evaluation timeline? Like I mentioned before, I have a lot of families that come to me and they're concerned because they feel like they've been seeking help for their child for a long time and they're just still not getting it. And in months, and particularly even school years, in some cases, they've been asking, they haven't got the help that they need. My suggestion for that is to make a direct parental request for an evaluation. When you do that, I would suggest that you make your request in writing. You'll include some key information. You say specific trigger words like, I suspect that my child has a disability. They need an IEP. They need special education. Include those keywords in there because that's going to pull in the parental rights that attach to somebody that's suspected of having a disability, and you want to follow up with that parental request for an evaluation until they have you to sign your consent for evaluation. That's what's going to trigger your 60-day timeline. Up until that point, there's no timeline to how long it can go on. If you do this, that's going to make your data collection period occur concurrently with your formal evaluation. So I'm a psychologist and not a graphic designer. If I could take this phase 1 and phase 2 and place them side by side rather than sequentially, then that's the difference it's going to make if you make that direct parental request for an evaluation. So that being said, response to intervention or RTI cannot be used to delay an evaluation. The Office of Special Education Programs at the federal level has actually issued guidance saying that schools are not allowed to do that. So, in most cases, if you're making that official request, if there is some sort of evidence that your child is having difficulties, this can potentially speed up your evaluation at a much quicker rate than what it might otherwise happen. So just to kind of wrap up, review, talk about some conclusions as far as things that you want to consider whenever you're making the decision between a potential school evaluation or a private evaluation. You want to consider that a school evaluation is likely going to be conducted by somebody who is very much trained and has a lot of experience with assessment. That evaluation is going to put you on a direct path to determining your child could potentially qualify for special education services at school. On the flip side, it's not going to provide you with a diagnosis. And if you are looking for an overall comprehensive treatment plan, like you think there might be ADHD that needs medication, you think there might be anxiety or depression which needs therapeutic treatment, you want to make sure that you're getting all the information that you can and getting information about all those potential diagnoses so you can help your child as much as possible. A private psychoeducational evaluation is going to give you increased amounts of privacy and confidentiality. At the end of the evaluation, you can choose if you want to share the results or not. And with the school evaluation, that is going to become part of your child's records. As far as the time frame for which you want the evaluation to occur, we just talked about on the last few slides, the initial evaluation, how you can get up to the point of speeding up to that 60-day timeline quicker and not waiting for months or years for your evaluation. The school evaluation is going to be free of charge to you. However, if you go outside of the school, that could potentially be a big financial responsibility for you and your family. So those are things that you want to keep in mind and consider. And at the end of the day, when you're seeking school support, remember that the school is required to consider your private evaluation, but they're not required to accept fully, and they're not required to fully implement everything that is in your private evaluation. So lots of things to consider, lots of food for thought. So I hope that you guys have found this information helpful as far as things that you might want to consider if you suspect that your child may have dyslexia and they may need additional supports. So I got my contact information on here. My website is on here. I got lots of blogs. Those guides that I referenced earlier are on there. If you want to send me an email, my email is hello@youriepsource.com. If you wanted to back channel me any questions. But overall, those are the things that are some major considerations between school and private psychs. And I want to thank everybody for their attention and see what kind of questions are out there in the audience. So you ready for me to stop my share?
That'll work.
Okay.
And yes, we had a question about posting this recording, and we will definitely be posting this. Brandy, this was so helpful. There was so much great information here. We had a parent who asked specifically about when you get a private evaluation and then you bring that to the eligibility committee, or do you have specific tips or tricks for getting the eligibility committee to consider those diagnoses, consider those recommendations? Like, what can a parent do to sort of help that process along?
My suggestion would be to look at the information that you have in your private psychological evaluation and compare that to the special education eligibility criteria in your district. So, for example, in Georgia, the criteria say we've got to have some sort of a psychological processing deficit. So I would review my psychological evaluation report, and it might be like, we've got weaknesses in logical processing and working memory. Check, we have that criteria. The next criteria would be you've got to have some sort of academic underachievement. We've got low scores in oral reading fluency and basic reading. Check, we meet that criteria. And then the third thing would be, like, what kind of progress have they made with their progress monitoring data? The team should have kept you up to date with that going through the process. So I would go back and review my psych report, match it up with the criteria and see how they line up. My other tip for that would be, as a parent, you have the option to provide input, and I suggest that parents provide written input when they're going to IEP meetings or school meetings. So a lot of times in a school meeting, a casual question will be thrown out, Mr. Smith, what do you think about what we're proposing? And just a snippet, a paraphrase of what the parent's true thoughts are get recorded in the actual documentation. I encourage parents to write up your parent statement, those things that I just mentioned before about your own evidence about how your student qualifies to receive those services. I would write it up in my parent statement and have that on the record as a part of the meeting. So those are my main recommendations for how to get your private psych translated into some potential school services. Those are things that could help.
That makes a lot of sense. We have a parent who's also asking about a student who already has a diagnosis of dyslexia, already has an IEP, but then it looks like they are still behind. And when they're reviewing the IEP, it looks like evidence-based intervention isn't being used. So is that another time that you would talk to a parent about, how do you get that into the record, and what's your recommendation there?
Whether or not they're using the interventions correctly or not, that's getting like slightly outside of the lane of like what tonight's presentation was about, since it was more about, like which type of evaluation is going to be best for your child. That being said, on the school side of things with IEPs, a lot of times I see that there's a heavy emphasis on we're going to put into place some accommodations to, like just kind of bridge the gap with this child's deficits. And there are times when it seems like the intervention, the skill building side of things is not as heavily emphasized. So that would be a situation where you want to go back, pull out that evaluation information that points to what your child's specific needs are, and then use that to make a case for specific types of instructional programming that might help your child. So that one does get really tricky because, like I said, a lot of times we get focused on how can we do accommodations, and that skill building side gets left off, but it's still very, very important. So
Right.
Using your intervention, using your evaluation data to show that this is where we need additional intervention and skill building as well. That could be helpful to you.
So let's switch back a little bit to evaluations. Would there ever be a time when a parent might want to get a private evaluation and a school evaluation at the same time? Are there pros and cons to that?
There might be a situation where, like you might want different pieces of that information. However, as far as doing them at the same time, here's what I'm going to say what to not do first, and then like how you could potentially like get the information from both sources. What we don't want to do is to ask for testing at school and then go get a private evaluation at the same time, because if we have two different evaluators that are giving a child the same assessment within a short window of time, whoever gives that evaluation second, basically their results are going to be invalid. There could be potential practice effects, like, I've already seen these questions before. I recently had a child come into my office that, like when I pulled out one of the set of test materials, he's like, oh, I've seen this before. So it's like, oh, I guess we're doing a different test for you. So, usually I would say, like you want to make a decision and go with one or the other. You don't want to do both at the same time, because those results might not be valid depending upon which test the evaluator gave, if they gave the same test within a short window of time. So I usually recommend, like make a choice, go with one or the other. And if you need supplemental follow-up, from a school evaluation with a private psych, you can do that. If you have a private psych and the school needs to do additional testing to determine their eligibility, you can do that. But make sure that you're sharing those evaluation results, and whoever is doing that follow-up testing knows what's already been administered.
Great, thank you. We have a parent who's asking about, they have a private evaluation with some diagnoses. The child is doing some RTI work and is making some progress, but not enough progress and not a lot. And so really the parents would like to move ahead with the next steps. Any advice for helping the school to sort of move that timeline ahead? The school is saying it's not necessary yet.
That would be what I talked about in the last few slides of the presentation. I've seen many circumstances where families get looped up in that pre-referral phase, like we're just going to keep trying interventions. And there comes a point when, like we just need to move forward and get that child services after a while. And that's what it sounds like in this particular situation. My trick for speeding that up is going to be to make that direct parental request for an evaluation, make that request in writing. I usually try to find out who is the person at the school level that is the head special education person, and make sure that your request gets into that person's hands in addition to the principal as the leader of the school. The key words that you want to say in there are, I suspect my child has a disability, they need special education services. I also make reference to, I brought this up to you on A, B, and C occasions. Make that direct request, and then follow up until you get to the point of they're giving you that consent for evaluation to sign. That's going to put it on a timeline, and you know that it will be completed within 60 days. There won't be any more, how long is this going to take? So making that written request for an evaluation, specifically following up until you sign the consent for evaluation, which puts the timeline which the state is going to follow.
And I love the idea of putting the specific dates that you brought up so that you know that they know that you're keeping track of the timeline as well that's led you up to this actual 60-day timeline. Mm-hmm. When a parent gets a school evaluation and they think, this is not comprehensive enough, there are other issues that have been missed here. What are parents looking for? How are they sort of approaching that? How are they going to say, this is not comprehensive, we need something else?
I'm not exactly sure what the context for that question is. I think it could be one of a couple of things. If it's a situation where you're just completely in disagreement with the school's results, maybe the school says your child is fine, they don't need anything, that might be a situation where you want to request an IE, like I had mentioned in one of the slides near the end of the presentation. In that situation, like you disagree with the school's results, you want a private evaluation, like the district can be required to pay for that. That would be one way to remedy it if it was that type of situation. Another thing, and I'm not sure like what the person asking the question meant, it could be another potential type of situation where maybe the school was heavily focused on academic skills, but you might also suspect that your student has, like an attention problem or some sort of social emotional concern. Like we mentioned early in the presentation, a school psychologist can't diagnose those things. When I used to work in the schools, my reports would say things like, this child demonstrates behaviors similar to those who have been diagnosed with ADHD or something like that. So you can kind of, like tell about some of the things that are going on, even if you can't officially give the diagnosis. So that may be a situation where you want to follow up with a private psychologist, or maybe take that evaluation, talk to your medical doctor about those results and what they might mean for your child, and additional services or therapies or treatments that they might need. So that's what I think as far as, like if they feel like their evaluation was not comprehensive enough, some different routes that you might take depending upon what the issue was with it.
So how does a family go about finding a good independent evaluator? How do you know that they're a good evaluator? How you had mentioned also, so two parts. We had some parents who asked about, how do I find someone who I know is qualified, who's an independent evaluator that I want to go ahead and pay for a private evaluation? And then secondarily, if I wanted to go the university route or a training center, where in a university do I call? How do I even get that process started?
Well, the second question, I'll go ahead and answer that one first. The university training clinics are usually through the psychology department or through the College of Education, depending upon if it's coming down through a school psychology program or a clinical psychology program. So those would be the places that you would want to go to look up getting testing through a university clinic. As far as evaluating private providers, there are a lot of families that go to first their pediatrician or another provider that works with their child. They may have referral lists of providers that they work with in the community, and you can start with that. And then whenever you have got a list of people that you want to consider to potentially do the evaluation, like I mentioned before, we want to make sure that it's somebody that specializes in testing. They specialize in testing with children. And again, my personal slant is towards those of us out there that are both duly credentialed as school psychologists and licensed psychologists, because at the end of the day, if you want your evaluation report to potentially translate into school services, school accommodations, or if your child is attending a private school, you want to have a good list of recommendations and accommodations for how to meet their needs. Somebody that has specific training in school psychology is going to be really attuned to those details and make sure that you get all of that documented in your report. So kind of a triage approach. Let's get a list of people that could potentially work with us. When we narrow down that list, make sure that we find somebody that is dedicated to assessment and assessing children. And then from there, my personal preference is towards people that are duly credentialed and licensed.
So we had some specific questions about dyslexia, and really thinking about if you could talk a little bit about sort of review again, kind of what does an assessment for dyslexia look like? Kind of what does the psychological assessment look like? What kind of tests are you giving? And then could you mention a couple of assessments that people might recognize as they're reviewing the results of their evaluation?
Sure. So one of the main parts that we're going to have as a part of a psychoeducational evaluation is going to be an assessment of the student's overall cognitive functioning. So an IQ test. Some of the more popular IQ tests are going to be the WISC, the Wechsler individual, intelligence scale for children. Gosh, sorry about that.
Because we never call it that. We always just call it the WISC. We haven't said the name of the whole thing since graduate school.
It's real name. Yeah, that's exactly right. The Stanford Binet, the differential ability scales, the KABC, the Woodcock-Johnson test of cognitive abilities. Those are some of the main overall cognitive or IQ tests. Most of those tests are also going to break down several different areas of psychological processing. So they're going to give you information about that child's verbal abilities, visual spatial processing, fluid reasoning abilities, their working memory, processing speed. Some other tests that we might also want to administer to get some supplemental information about processing, phonological processing, the test called the CTOP, Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing. We use that one a lot, particularly so that we can see what's going on with phonological awareness, phonological memory, rapid naming. Also, there are specific tests that are out there for auditory processing, visual processing, to see if there's any deficits in those areas. Also, some particular memory assessments. So we might use some of those. Achievement testing, that would be tests that look specifically at oral language, reading, writing, and math skills. Some of those might be the Wyatt, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test. We might have the Woodcock-Johnson also has an achievement test that goes along with that battery. The KTEA is going to give us information about those achievement, how they're doing with reading, writing, and math. So those are going to be the main ones that we're using as far as oral achievement, psychological processing, and their overall IQ. A lot of times we need to also further assess, are there attention concerns or all their social, emotional, behavioral types of concerns that could be impacting that student's learning or achievement. But the ones that I said before, they're the main IQ tests, processing tests. Also, some of the newer tests that have come out, particularly looking at academic skills and also processing areas related to dyslexia, would be the Pfeiffer assessment of reading. So that's another one that's starting to get a lot more use and provide a lot of information that we can use for diagnosis, as well as figuring out what interventions are going to be the best for a student.
So a parent asked a follow-up question about if you get a school evaluation and you don't receive a diagnosis of dyslexia, but you have all the descriptors that, as you mentioned, the school psychologist who's in a school who's particularly savvy has said, this presents a lot like a student who has a diagnosis of dyslexia. And so everyone sort of knows what that means. Are there implications for them later on if they don't actually have that diagnosis?
I think that goes back to near the beginning of the presentation. We talked about, what is it that you're seeking to get from the evaluation? If you're mainly looking for having a description of what's going on with your student, what their strengths and weaknesses are, if you know those strengths, then you can use those to kind of fill in for some of the weaknesses or disadvantages that student has. If you know their weaknesses, then you can know these are the areas that we need to target for intervention. Those are the main things that you need to know in order to access services and also put in place a targeted plan that's going to meet that child's needs and help them to be more successful. So, at the end of the day, if the choices are, you can have the term dyslexia or not get any services, I'm going to let them go ahead and call it specific learning disability so that my child can get access to those services. In a perfect world, we would all line up and fall in line with, the right terminology that everyone can agree on and definitions and titles that, everyone uses. But for now, this is what we've got. There's a lot of information out there that suggests, let's just go ahead and, if it's dyslexia, let's go ahead and call it that and give it that name so that we can, have a common language to use to help that person understand what's going on with them and to help the person working with them understand what's going on with them. Hopefully some of the legislation that's going through, some of the, state level things that are being passed, and potentially some of the federal level things that we could get put in place could get us closer together on that common language. But for now, I think it's really important to do what we can to get kids the services that they need.
So in terms of a student who, let's say an older student who already has maybe been in public school, hasn't received an official diagnosis of dyslexia because they've been doing school evaluations, have an IEP for specific learning disability, how does that translate for their accommodations for SAT, ACT, or college? Do they need that diagnosis, or will what they have in the school system suffice?
Actually, what SAT and ACT have been asking for is, we've got to have a diagnosis that is supported through a psychological evaluation. They've also started placing a lot more emphasis on documentation of having had accommodations at the school level. So the psychological evaluation, documenting your diagnosis is a part of it. They're also asking for documentation to show in the school setting you've required extra time, specific accommodations, like having the materials read or things like that. So in addition to the psychological testing, they're also asking for that school documentation. In a lot of cases, I've seen people be able to submit school psychological evaluations and be able to have that along with, showing that they've had a 504 plan or an IEP, submit that and have that be sufficient for getting accommodations for SAT and ACT. So usually those things together is sufficient.
And so when in high school should parents start thinking about that?
If it's at all possible to time it up, if you think that your student could, be going to college and they might need accommodations at the college level, many schools, even though each school is different based on what their criteria are for college accommodations, a lot of them require that individual has been tested using adult measures. So before, when I mentioned those IQ tests and I got all stumbled up, I was talking about the children's IQ test. When an individual is 16 years old, then we can start administering an adult IQ test to them. So I have had situations with kids who are 15, and I tell their parent, like, if you want to use this testing for college as well as ACT, SAT accommodations, come back in a few months after your birthday, because that evaluation will get you covered for both of those things and not have to do testing at 15 now. And then, like, every summer I get a rush of people that come in and they say, we're going to college in 3 weeks. Can we get our evaluation done before we go? So, if you can at all time it up within that 16 to 17 time range so that they can be tested on adult measures, if it's at all possible to do that, that would be the easiest, best time in order to solve multiple issues that you might have and need an evaluation going forward.
So that makes a lot of sense. If you're doing that around that sophomore year, then you've taken care of SAT, ACT, and college all with one evaluation, and then you've been able to cover that. Particularly if you're doing a private evaluation, that's going to be costly to the family. Dr. We cannot thank you enough for all of this great information. You've given us so much to think about. It was such a thorough presentation for us. We want to thank all of our participants for being here tonight and being at the outreach. You're going to receive an email that has a short survey and a certificate of attendance request form. And also, if you asked a question in the chat that we didn't get to, or you posted something earlier when you registered and you want to know, Dr. Tanner put her information up earlier, and you can also reach out to IDA Georgia, and we are happy to answer your questions in the best way. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Dr. Tanner, thank you again. Great presentation, and we hope you all have a great evening.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Good night.